Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our Cancer Conversations sponsored by UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. My name is Jennifer Potter and I'll be your moderator today. If you have any questions at all or need technical support during the presentation, please call us at 919-445-1000. We want to make sure that you're able to participate and are here to help. Today's presentation is going to be about clinical trials, and we're delighted to have Miss Patty Spears with us today. She is a 20-year cancer survivor, a cancer research patient advocate, and a science research manager. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Miss Spears.
Good afternoon. It's nice to be here with you today. I'm a patient advocate at UNC Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center, where I lead two different research patient advocacy groups within Lineberger. And like Jennifer said, I am a cancer survivor, and throughout my treatment, I have actually participated in two clinical trials, so I have experience on both sides. As a patient interested in research, I've always been interested in research with a science background. I understand the value of myself participating in clinical trials, so I hope through this conversation I'll, that you will become have a better understanding of clinical trials and the value of your participation in those clinical trials. The people around me have also been interested in clinical trials. In my family, my mother, my father, and my sister have all participated in cancer clinical trials, so we all value our input into clinical trials. I hope that by giving this, you'll understand not only the importance of participating, but also help people understand what clinical trials are. And if you do ask about it, a clinical trial in your area, in your hospital, that when you hear the doctor talk about it, that you'll understand a few of the words that you hear about clinical trials. So we'll move on in. So this is the outline of my presentation. So I will first start by defining what a clinical trial is. I will be mentioning clinical trials throughout my talk, so I hope that we'll be on the same page on what they actually are. I will also give you an overview of the big picture. So that would be the research process. So I'll give you an overview of the research process and how clinical trials fit into that process and what value they add to the process and what role that they play. Then I'll go into a little bit more detail about clinical trials and the types of clinical trials and some key phrases that you might hear when you talk about your doctor about clinical trials. And if you decide to participate or learn more, you'll have a better understanding of what you're reading or hearing about. And then we all know that there's a lot of myths out there about clinical trials and participating in clinical trials. So what I'll try to do is dispel some of the major myths out there, not all of them. There's lots of myths out there, so that you can feel more sure about participating or have more confidence in asking more about clinical trials. So first we'll begin with what is a clinical trial. Clinical trials are research studies, so they are research studies involving people, and these people volunteer to participate. So clinical trials try to answer a scientific question and find better ways to prevent, diagnose, and treat cancer. All of the advances that we enjoy in cancer as well as other diseases must first be tested in a clinical trial. So I have some little pop-ups that will come up throughout the presentation about did you know, and these are just some things that I really want you to know about clinical trials in the long run. So doctors don't always know which treatment is better. The only way to find out is to run the clinical trial. So there are many different people that are involved in in advancing our knowledge in preventing, diagnosing, and treating cancer better. And all of these people are critical to the research process. So I'll be going into the research process, but I wanted to introduce you to some of these people. We have people that are scientists, the scientists that work in the laboratory, to doctors and nurses who work with patients, and of course the patients themselves. Clinical trials are part of this larger research process, and so, I want us to learn a little bit more about it. So we'll take a look at how these people all are important in bringing advancements in care to patients through clinical trials. So what I really want you to know about this is that most important thing is that cancer research is the path to new treatments. So new treatments are needed to improve not only the lives of patients, but also they might lessen side effects of current patients. The research process begins with basic research, which is also called bench research, and this is done in the laboratory. This research is the foundation of knowledge where we learn to begin to understand how cancer cells work. And this is important. If we want to learn how to kill the cancer cells, we have to know how the cancer cells work first. And then during the translational phase, which is the next phase, these new ideas and discoveries made in basic research are often tested in live laboratory animals, most often in mice or rats. This can also include testing in human tissue. Not all treatments that work in mice will work in humans. Many are found to be either too toxic or just not effective. It then goes on to the clinical trial phase, and the clinical trial phase tests new treatments in patients. The new treatments that are successful in mice and not too toxic in mice are tested in people. We'll learn much more about the clinical trial process and what is needed for treatments to make it to the bedside later. But the next step is the patient bedside and to be used in patient treatment. Once a treatment is approved for use in patients, actually we can still use information gained by those treatments that are being used in patients and feed that back to basic science. And it can be used to develop even better treatments in the future. So how do these people play? How do all the players play in this process? I told you about scientists and nurses and patients and doctors. So many different scientists play a role in basic research. Basic research involves quite a few different types of science. Some scientists look at the tumor, others look at the drugs, and some even look at devices. There are many different scientists trying to learn more about how to prevent, diagnose, and treat cancer. During the translational phase, translational research, it's often a collaboration of the scientist and the doctors. So you usually have a basic scientist or a scientist that works with a clinical researcher. Because in this phase, knowing more about the patients is important so that the right clinical translational research can be done. And then clinical trials are conducted by doctors or clinicians in your clinic. And clinical trials also involve a lot of medical staff, including nurses. But most importantly, they involve patients who volunteer to be in the clinical trials. And of course, patients are the center and driving force behind the entire research process that will bring advanced treatments to patients. So another pop-up, and this is important. Most people think that only new drugs are tested in clinical trials, but there are many different types of interventions tested in clinical trials, and we'll go over a few in this slide. So prevention clinical trials are clinical trials that might test lifestyle interventions, diet, control of your weight, smoking, and they look at ways to reduce the risk of developing cancer. Also, screening and early detection studies are important for finding cancers in the general population. So as you know, prevention and screening trials noted here require people who do not have cancer to participate. There are also clinical trials for patients diagnosed after diagnosis and treatment, looking at how they function and survive after cancer. And then, of course, clinical trials that test new treatment options. Those are the most common that people think about when they think about clinical trials. And these include testing of not only new chemotherapy drugs, but also biologic drugs, immunotherapies, and any new drug. But they also include looking at surgical procedures, radiology procedures, because they all have to be proven effective in clinical trials. So when I did a clinical trial, I actually did a clinical trial after my treatment to look at an intervention that might prevent my cancer from coming back. So that kind of fell into a few different categories. So each of these categories might actually overlap with each other as well. So now we'll go into the nitty-gritty of clinical trials. And so I'll try to feed it to you in little bits and pieces so it's not too overwhelming. But clinical trials are performed by going through a series of steps. And these steps are called phases. And there are usually 4 phases of clinical trials. And the thing to remember that I'll probably say over and over again is that phases always go in order. One phase is completed before you can go to the next phase. And they are classically known as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. So each phase has a different purpose along this path and along the steps. A different question is asked and answered. So a new drug has to be successful in one phase before it can go to another phase, and not all drugs are successful and not all drugs complete this path. Some are found to have too many side effects, have severe side effects, and others are just not effective in humans, even if they were effective in mice. We'll go over each phase, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I will tell you the purpose of each phase. I will tell you the number of people involved, or the approximate number, and the approximate time to completion for each phase. And did you know that major breakthroughs could not happen without the generosity of clinical trial participants, young and old? We value our clinical trial participants because science cannot move forward without the volunteer of patients into clinical trials. So we'll start with phase 1. So phase 1 studies are usually the first time a drug is being tested in people. And this will clearly be stated to the participant before you join the trial. This phase is not designed to test if the drug is effective, but rather how much drug can be given before it becomes too toxic with side effects. So which drug is safe, which dose is safe for people. So these drugs have usually been used in mice, but not in people, so they have to test this. The type of clinical trial uses the least number of people and usually is done over several months. The clinical trial usually starts at a low dose and increases the dose as the study goes on to reach the maximum dose that patients can tolerate without side effects. This is the safest way to test new drugs in people. It's important to understand each phase and the risks and benefits that are involved. In phase 1, studies do have the highest risk, but it is the first time the drug is being used in patients. So as a patient, it's a time to get a new drug that has not been used in anyone else. So if you need a new drug, it's a perfect time. I've known many patients that have participated in phase 1 clinical trials where the drug has worked successfully for them and they have been able to stay on the drug for a while. Phase 2 studies is the next step. So the next step is to test if the drug actually works and is it effective in people. And this is done by looking at the cancer to see if it gets smaller or bigger, or if it spreads to other parts of the body. I did a phase 2 clinical trial where they actually looked at markers in my blood and how my body was reacting to the drug as the effectiveness of the drug. So there are many different things that they can look at to see if it's effective, and that's clearly stated to the patient before they enroll in the study. And of course, the safety is always looked at in every phase of a clinical trial, and so the safety will be looked at in this phase as well. The study uses a little bit more number of patients, 100 to 300 people usually in these clinical trials. It can be more than 300 as well, and usually takes a little bit longer to complete, up to 2 years or maybe more to complete. And as you can see, each phase has more people. And as you have more people, it takes more time to enroll those people into studies. So usually each phase involves more time as well. So the next phase is phase 3 clinical trials, where the new drug is tested against the standard of care, which is the treatment that is usually given to you as a patient. In most cancer clinical trials, everyone gets standard of care. All patients get the best care available. So phase 3 studies are important because this will lead us in the direction to see if this new drug is effective and if it can be referred to the Food and Drug Administration for approval as a new and better treatment for all cancer patients. So phase 3 clinical trials use the most number of patients, about 1,000 to 3,000 people, and can take many years to complete, 1 to 4 years or even more than 4 years, depending on what outcome they are looking for, what effect they are looking for. It requires many people, so it takes a long time because those people have to join the study. This type of study has the least risk. It's already been through the phase 1 and phase 2 study, but it is still experimental, and the information on side effects is still gathered during these studies. And these are probably the studies that they enroll the most people, so these are the ones that you'll probably run across the most. The next phase is called phase 4 clinical trials, but they're not really clinical trials. People are not entered into this phase, but rather it's an ongoing process of gathering information after the drug has received FDA approval and is being used in the general population. Phase 4 trials are trials that follow many people, whoever takes the drug, so there's no specific number of people that are involved in this study, and it takes any length of time. It depends on how long they want to follow. In recent days, they've been following patients longer because we realize that there are some long-term side effects that come up years later from certain interventions and certain drugs. So it's up to the developer and FDA on how long they're followed. Important information can be learned about effectiveness and side effects as a large number of people start taking these drugs. So I just reviewed a whole lot of information about the 4 phases of clinical trials, and it might seem like a lot of information. I like to look at things in pictures, so I drew a nice picture for you. It helps me understand the difference between the different phases. And so in this graphic, I have in there not only the purpose, also the number of people that take part, and approximately how long it takes. So I want to point out a few things that I think are important to remember going forward about the 4 phases of clinical trials, is that each phase involves more people than the prior phase. Each phase takes longer to complete than the prior phase. Each phase asks a specific question that's different from the phase before it. But in every phase, the safety of the drug is looked at, because as you go up the steps and down the path from phase 1 to phase 4, more and more people are exposed to the drug, so you can get more information about the safety of the drug. And that's always very important for patients to know what the side effects are of the drugs that they're taking, and this is the way that that information is gathered for us. So now I'll go into what is a clinical trial. We know that it's a research study, but what does a typical clinical trial look like? So this is one type of a clinical trial design where you have a defined population that's randomized to receive either the standard treatment. Most clinical trials, I would say, almost all, I would say all, but I never say all. Most everybody gets standard treatment or standard of treatment plus a new treatment. And then in each arm you look for improvement or not improvement. And this is your basic clinical trial that you might come across. And so the purpose is to compare this new treatment to the standard treatment. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and describe some words that I think are important for you to know about clinical trials, so that come up a lot when I talk to patients about clinical trials. The first word is eligibility. This is an important part of a clinical trial. Eligibility is the characteristics that determine who can enter a specific clinical trial. They define the clinical trial population. So what is eligibility? So eligibility, each clinical trial has guidelines for who can or cannot participate in the study. And these guidelines are called eligibility criteria, describing characteristics that must be shared by all participants. So for example, in a clinical trial, you'll have inclusion criteria. And these are just things that people must have in order to enroll in the study. So for this example, out of all people with cancer, the only people that can enroll in this study are people with colon cancer. So inclusion might include specific disease types, even stage of disease or things like that. You also have things called exclusion criteria, and these are things that patients cannot have that join that study. And these might be medical conditions. For example, most studies don't allow pregnant participants, and so pregnancy would be an exclusion criteria. And eligibility criteria are different for each clinical trial. So if you don't qualify for one or have the correct eligibility for one trial, you can try a different trial because you might be eligible for that one. So if you are eligible to participate in a clinical trial, every clinical trial begins with informed consent. So informed consent is a process that helps patients understand the clinical trial as they are deciding whether to join the clinical trial. So informed consent really involves a conversation between the researcher and the potential participant. And every participant must sign an informed consent form before joining a clinical trial. Now, the informed consent form is a very important document. It gives you all the information you need to know about that clinical trial. And the informed consent form must present the information about the clinical trial in a language that is understandable to the participant who signs the form. So the informed consent will explain why the trial is being done, as well as potential harms and benefits of the trial. So at this point, when you're having your conversation about a clinical trial and being consented to a trial and the conversation, and you look at the form and they go through the form, this is the time to really ask questions about the clinical trial and find out more about it, because that's the point of the form, is to guide the conversation through the clinical trial, what the purpose is and what you have to do in the clinical trial. And this is the time where, don't be afraid to ask questions. The person consenting you is very used to being asked questions and very willing to answer any question you have about it, because you should understand everything about the clinical trial after you talk to the researcher and sign the consent form. This is an area that I really do a lot of work in as a research advocate, so I'm really interested in patients being fully informed before they sign on to a clinical trial. Randomization is used in many but not all clinical trials. So I participated in 2 clinical trials, and neither of them had randomization involved. One was testing 3 different doses of a medication. So you just went into a different dose depending on when you were consented to the trial, in order of low dose to high dose. And the other one was a surgery or no surgery trial. So that was really hard to randomize. So the patient got to choose which arm they wanted to go in. And then they just followed the patient after it. So randomization is not always there, but sometimes it's necessary and it's there. So what is randomization? So randomization is a process by which participants are assigned by chance to separate groups that are given different treatments and different treatments groups in the clinical trial. So this is on the side is the simplest trial design, where one group receives the new treatment, this is the investigational group, and the other group receives standard treatment, the control group. So why do we do randomization? So randomization helps with the bias, since people are assigned to group by chance. Bias occurs when a trial's results are affected by human choice or other factors not related to the treatment being tested. Because certain patients will choose different things based on their characteristics and not by chance. So sometimes it's important to have randomization. And placebo. Placebo is sometimes, but not always, in a cancer clinical trial, but it's important to note that placebo will never replace standard of care. It will be given in addition to standard of care in most cancer clinical trials. So I think this is one area where a lot of patients are afraid of a clinical trial because of placebo, and there's no reason to do that. Placebo is an inactive drug or treatment used in a clinical trial. Placebo-controlled trials compare a new treatment with a placebo. The placebo is usually combined with standard treatment, and this is really important. You will always have standard treatment regardless of that, and sometimes placebos are necessary to really find out if a drug is effective or not, or if it's better than standard of care, and these are usually in phase 3 clinical trials. And when a placebo is used in a study, it is done always with the full knowledge of the participant that this will be clearly defined in the consent form, and you will know whether the trial that you're signing, enrolling in has a placebo. So to review, these are the words that you might come across when you ask your doctor about clinical trials, and if you find a trial that's right for you. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully it was given in enough little snippets that you can understand it. So now we'll go into a little bit about the myths and facts about clinical trial participation. So I will review a few common myths and tell you the facts and what you should know. So I'm sure everybody has heard this myth, I'll be treated like a guinea pig. The fact is that the opposite is true. Participants are treated with respect and dignity. So if you ask clinical trial participants, many felt they were treated with respect and dignity. Many felt they were fully informed of the potential harms and benefits of the clinical trial. Many had a very positive experience, and many would recommend a clinical trial to others. And a lot of people in clinical trials feel like they get extra care in clinical trials. Sometimes there are extra office visits and extra testing being done, and sometimes that really makes the patient feel like they're being watched very closely and being really extra attention to their disease. So I've heard this before, I'm too old for a clinical trial. This is just not true. Older people are actually needed in clinical trials, and you are not too old to participate in a clinical trial. Many clinical trials now have no upper age limit, and in cancer that's really important because many cancer patients, about 63%, 63 of 100 cancer patients are over the age of 65. However, in our clinical trials, the number of trial participants is only about 25% are over the age of 65. So we really need more older patients participating in clinical trials. So I've heard this many times, that clinical trials are only the last hope when I have no other choice. This is not true at all, and I hope that by viewing this presentation you know that now, that clinical trials cover a vast range of not only stages of cancer, but also involve people that don't even have cancer to do prevention and screening trials, and then survivorship trials looking at quality of life. New treatments are so clinical trials are a great way for patients to get access to new therapies that are not available any other way. So it's really for all patients, not just those that have no other choice. Another thing that I like to stress about clinical trials is this myth. So people think that once I join a clinical trial, I have to stay on the clinical trial. Well, that is just not true. You are in control, and you can withdraw from a clinical trial at any time. You can withdraw actually 5 minutes after you sign the consent form. You can say, hey, I changed my mind. You can, usually you're allowed to bring the consent form home, talk to family about it, then come back before you sign it. And, you know, if a couple of days later you decide, you can withdraw from the clinical trial. You can withdraw at any time. And your standard of care will not change. You will still be treated for your cancer with standard of care, and nothing will change. And when withdrawing from the study, we do ask that you, contact the research team, and this is actually outlined in the consent form and tells you how to do it, and it's clearly described. So you are in control, and you can withdraw at any time. So my take-home message is that I think every patient should ask your doctor about clinical trials. They're your main source. They're the ones that know what's going on, and they're the ones that can point you in the right direction. If they don't know if there's a clinical trial for you, they might be able to connect you to the right person. Clinical trials show researchers what does and doesn't work in people, so it's really, really important. And I really want you to take home that there are many types of clinical trials, not just treatment trials and new drugs. There are trials in prevention, screening, diagnosis. There's surgical trials, radiation trials, detection and diagnosis, quality of life, survivorship, as well as the new drugs being tested in treatment trials. And also that new cancer treatments are only available because they were tested in clinical trials. So this is really the final message, is that clinical trials are an important part and an important step in the discovery of new treatments for cancer and other diseases, in new ways to detect, diagnose, and reduce the risk of cancer. And I think that's all I have. So questions?
Okay, well, thank you, Patty, for that informative presentation. I just wanted to draw your attention to the email address on your screen. We would love to answer any questions you have about what you learned today. So please email us at cc@med.unc.edu, and those questions will come through and we'll answer them right here on camera. But while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I wondered if you could address when you're in a clinical trial, do you have to change physicians?
No. During the clinical trial, you might see a different physician during that time, depending on the clinical trial, but your main physician will always be your main physician. I participated in a clinical trial, and that was actually in Seattle, Washington from here, so I maintained my doctor here, but I also had doctors in Seattle that were part of that clinical trial. Some trials last longer, so you might, but there's a big push now for clinical trials to be more accessible into the community. And doing that, it's like certain things do have to be done in certain institutions that have access to different things, but when you have a home base with a home clinician and a home oncologist, it's really nice to stay there and get your blood work done and different scans that you get done there. So there's a real push to say what can be done there and what has to be done at a bigger center. Sure. And so we're really trying to push it out to have it more in the realm of the community oncologist.
Great. And do you get a lot of questions about finances? Are clinical trials usually covered, or are there expenses?
So that's been really studied now a lot. I think people really don't know, and every clinical trial is different. When I work with researchers as a patient advocate, that's one of the things that I ask about a clinical trial. If there's a scan, a lot of clinical trials are based on standard of care, and so your insurance company pays for what standard of care is. If there's any research biopsy or research scan, they try to get that covered in the trial, but in your clinical trial, you might have more office visits. I did the prevention clinical trial at an institution, and I had more office visits, and those are charged to your insurance company. So if you have a deductible or copay, you need to pay that. But we really try to keep the expense down, but I think there might be some added cost, and that's where your consent form comes in again. We're really trying to tease out what's standard of care and covered by insurance and what's research-based and covered by research, or what you might be responsible for. So I think that's really important to discuss that during the consent process.
That's good advice. And actually a question just came in about that very thing, so I hope that we address that. What are the best ways to find out about clinical trials that are appropriate for your disease, or maybe in your hometown? What are some resources that people can turn to? So
there's a lot of different resources, but there's not like any coordination. So it's really hard. It is hard. But the first step is with your physician, clinician. Ask them about it. Also, if you have a disease that has a nonprofit, I'm a breast cancer advocate, but my father was diagnosed with leukemia, and I didn't know a lot about leukemia. So when I found out about it, I called the Leukemia Lymphoma Society and talked to them about a clinical trial that my dad was approached with. And that was really useful. And some of these disease sites have different ways that they have those trials and those diseases kind of isolated out for you. There's a big national clinical trial database that's really hard to use for a patient, so I wouldn't really drive anybody there. But go to your disease site nonprofit and see if they have something specific for your disease, and you might have better luck.
Yeah,
but your doctor and your institution is really the place to go.
Yeah. Having been in some clinical trials yourself, what would you say to someone who's anxious about being offered a clinical trial in the first place? I think you touched on this a little bit in your myths, but do you have any advice for people who it just makes them nervous thinking about it?
I've never been nervous about it because I was in the research realm, but I know other people that have. And I think, that trusted source, your physician is your trusted source, and just talk to them about it. And really, there's different reasons to do a clinical trial as a patient. I did a clinical trial because I wanted to do something to prevent my cancer from coming back because I had no other treatments after my chemotherapy ended. So it was all about me, right? So sometimes it's all about you and getting you the best care that you think that you need and something that you think might work or whatever. And then other times it's altruistic. It's for other people. I have family members. I have a daughter and a sister. And, it's like we really need to move this forward and for the research endeavor just to move it forward. So there's different reasons for doing it. And so you come with different anxiety. But I think in talking to your physician and the research staff, the staff that does the consenting is very knowledgeable. And they can really walk you through any of the fears that you might have.
Yeah, thank you. Someone who's watching asked, do participants ever get paid to participate in a clinical trial?
Not very often,
No.
But it does happen occasionally. And I actually was on a call and they had some reimbursement for patients. And I was like, I've never heard of that before. But usually, no, it's all altruistic.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So you could cross your fingers.
Because that's the line that you don't want to coerce patients into a clinical trial. You volunteer to be in the clinical trial.
Okay, so, wonderful.
Yeah.
And if people go home tonight and are kind of digesting this information, is it okay if they continue to submit questions?
Oh, definitely.
And we can address them off camera? Okay.
Oh, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, that'll be today's presentation about clinical trials. And again, feel free to use our email address throughout the day, and Patty has generously volunteered her time to answer any questions you have. And we just wanted to bring your attention to next month's Cancer Conversations, which will be about understanding prevention and treatment of skin cancer with Dr. David Alilla. That'll be on Friday, May 17th at 12 o'clock noon. So we hope to see you then. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope that this has been helpful. Thank you so much, Patty. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.